My name is Nora Kessler. I'm 34 years old, and for 11 months, every single Friday I came home from my night shift at the hospital to find a yellow violation notice taped to my front door. Improper trash bin placement, $75. Unapproved exterior paint touch-up, $75. Holiday lights left up 2 days past the bylaw deadline, $75. 11 months of Fridays, signed at the bottom in the same tidy, familiar handwriting, HOA President D. Ashworth, my mother. I want to be clear about something before I explain the rest of this, because I think it matters. My mother didn't just happen to be the HOA president of the neighborhood I live in. She ran for that seat 11 months ago, unopposed, 3 weeks after I told my sister no. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the smallest possible weapon, a clipboard and a fine schedule, can still do enormous damage in the right hands. If you've ever had someone in your own family use a position of small authority against you specifically, this one's for you. Subscribe and drop a comment before we start, because what finally happened at that annual meeting is the part I still can't quite believe I lived through. I should explain the house first, because the house is really where all of this started. It belonged to my grandmother, Eleanor, who passed away 2 years ago, and left it to me outright, specifically to me, not split with my sister Whitney the way most of her other belongings were divided. I moved in 8 months after the funeral, into the same modest ranch-style neighborhood my mother had lived in for over a decade, close enough that I could see her porch light from my own driveway on clear nights. I never thought that proximity would become a weapon. The first year in that house was ordinary in every way I could have hoped for. I painted the guest room, replaced the ancient water heater, planted the same rose bushes my grandmother used to keep along the side fence. My mother came by for dinner most weeks that first year, brought casseroles, seemed genuinely happy I'd stayed close. Looking back now, I think that ordinary year is exactly what made the next 11 months so disorienting, the whiplash of going from casseroles to certified mail almost overnight. The first contradiction showed up quietly, the way most of them do, buried in the neighborhood's own public violation log, which our HOA management company posts online for transparency. I found it on a Tuesday, curious after my 4th consecutive fine, and scrolled back through a full year of citations across every house on our street. Nobody else had been fined more than once. Several houses with far more obvious issues, a fence that had been leaning for months, a boat parked in a driveway well past the allowed window, hadn't been cited at all. I sat with my laptop open in my kitchen, and understood, for the first time, that whatever this was, it wasn't really about trash bins. The first hidden detail came from my own phone, an old text thread I hadn't looked at in almost a year. 11 months earlier, right around the time the fines started, my sister Whitney had asked me for $18,000, money she needed, she said, to get through her divorce cleanly, framed as something I owed the family given what I'd inherited. I'd said no, gently but firmly, and my mother had texted me 2 days later, a single line I'd mostly forgotten until I scrolled back to it that Tuesday night. "You'll regret not helping your sister." I'd read it at the time as an angry, overprotective mother venting. Sitting with it now, next to a year of Friday fines, it read like something closer to a promise. The trust shift came from Owen Marsh, our HOA treasurer, a quiet, unassuming man I'd always assumed was simply my mother's reliable yes-man on the board. I asked him, almost offhandedly at a neighborhood cleanup event, whether the board typically reviewed violation notices before they went out. He hesitated long enough that I noticed, then said, carefully, that he'd actually been meaning to ask someone the same question himself, because he'd noticed a few notices going out under his own signature block on collection letters that he didn't remember approving. Owen struck me in that conversation as a man who'd spent years quietly deferring to my mother's confidence without ever quite examining what that deference was costing him personally, and something about being CC'd on documents he hadn't reviewed seemed to have finally cracked something loose in him. He didn't offer to help me outright that day. He just said, almost to himself, that he'd been meaning to look more closely at a few things, and I filed that away as the first sign that my mother's version of events might not survive contact with her own board. The personal betrayal became undeniable once I formally requested the violation issuance log. a right explicitly granted to homeowners under our HOA's own governing documents. Every single fine against my property, all 11 months of them, had been logged and issued personally by my mother, bypassing the third-party inspection company that handled violations for every other house in the neighborhood. She hadn't just allowed this to happen through neglect. She had built it, individually, by hand, one Friday at a time. The first real consequence arrived by certified mail, 3 weeks later, a formal notice from the HOA's management company stating that my unpaid balance had crossed the threshold, requiring a property lien, effective within 30 days unless resolved, the total now sitting at just over $3,200. A lien on my grandmother's house, over trash bins and paint touch-ups. Timed, I was starting to understand, with an unsettling kind of precision. The unexpected ally arrived through Owen again, calling me one evening, his voice lower than I'd heard it before, saying he'd pulled some of the board's older records after our conversation, and found something that had been bothering him ever since. He said he wasn't sure yet what it meant, that he thought I should see it before the lien deadline passed, and that he felt increasingly like he'd been signing his name to things he hadn't actually reviewed for longer than just my case. The evidence that changed everything came from our HOA's own governing documents, the CC&Rs I finally sat down and read in full for the first time since closing on the house. Buried in the enforcement section was a clause requiring any violation notice to be issued through the board's designated inspection process, with the HOA president explicitly prohibited from personally initiating citations outside that process. A conflict of interest safeguard, apparently, that had simply never been tested until my mother decided to test it against her own daughter. I felt for a few days after finding that clause something close to relief, the sense that this could be resolved cleanly, procedurally, without ever needing to become a public spectacle. I sent a formal written dispute to the management company citing the exact clause, and within a week they paused the lien process pending internal review. I let myself believe briefly that this might simply end there quietly on paper. The second betrayal came from Owen's records again, an email chain accidentally CC'd to the general HOA inbox months earlier that nobody had thought to flag until Owen went digging with real purpose. In it, my mother had written to Whitney, "Keep the pressure up. She'll cave before the annual meeting. You'll have your half by spring." My sister hadn't just known about the fines. She'd been counting on them, tracking my growing debt like a countdown to money she believed, incorrectly, was rightfully hers. The stakes became formally legal the following week. I filed an official grievance with the HOA board citing the CC&R violation, and separately consulted a real estate attorney, Priya Chandran, about the lien threat and what she described as a genuinely unusual pattern of selective enforcement that could, depending on how the board responded, cross into something closer to harassment through misuse of an official position. The hidden motive surfaced when I finally sat my mother down, alone, at her kitchen table, and asked her directly why this had started when it did. She didn't deny any of it, which surprised me more than a denial would have. She said Whitney was drowning, that the divorce had left her with almost nothing, that she believed, genuinely believed, that grandmother's decision to leave me the house outright had been unfair to Whitney, and that if enough pressure built up around the property, I'd eventually choose to sell it and split the proceeds the way she'd always felt the will should have read in the first place. I asked her, once I could trust my voice again, whether she'd really thought I'd never notice, never connect 11 months of fines to a text message she'd sent the same week they started. She said she'd hoped, honestly, that I'd simply give in before it ever came to that she'd imagined this ending quietly, with me handing Whitney a check, and everyone moving on, and that watching me instead investigate the bylaws and request formal logs hadn't been part of any version of this she'd actually planned for. The difficult choice arrived with that confession still sitting heavy in my chest. I had by then more than enough documentation to bring this to the full HOA board, and, if I wanted, to the annual meeting itself, in front of every neighbor who'd wonder why their board president had spent 11 months quietly targeting her own daughter. I could resolve this privately, letting the paused lien simply lapse and never speaking of it publicly, protecting whatever fragile relationship still existed between my mother and me, or I could let this become exactly the kind of accountability that only happens in the open, in front of the people whose trust she'd been elected to hold. The hidden history came from a sealed letter my grandmother's attorney had kept on file, one I'd never been shown at the initial reading of the will, because it was addressed specifically to me, to be delivered only if a dispute over the house ever arose. In it, my grandmother explained plainly that she'd left the house to me alone because Whitney had borrowed nearly $20,000 from her 4 years before her death, money never repaid, and that she'd never trusted my mother to manage anything left to Whitney directly without it eventually being spent or redirected. The inheritance hadn't been an oversight or an insult to my sister. It had been my grandmother's last careful attempt to protect money she knew, from painful experience, wouldn't stay protected any other way. The power shift came from the combination now sitting in Priya's file, the CC&R violation, the misused treasurer's signature, the email chain proving premeditated collusion with Whitney, and my grandmother's own letter establishing motive on the other side. Under our HOA's bylaws, board members could be removed for cause by a majority vote at the annual meeting, provided formal notice and documentation were submitted in advance, which I now had more than enough of to file. The desperate countermove came exactly 9 days before the annual meeting, when my mother attempted to call an emergency closed session to quietly resolve the violation log before it could become a public agenda item, a maneuver Owen refused to authorize, citing the bylaws requirement that all board members receive proper notice, which meant for the first time in 11 months, my mother couldn't simply handle this the way she'd handled everything else, privately and on her own terms. The evidence that finally closed the last gap came from Owen, reviewing the HOA's bank records more carefully than anyone apparently had in years, and finding that several of my own fine payments, the ones I'd reluctantly paid early on just to avoid escalation, had been deposited not into the HOA's main reserve account, but into a secondary sub-account my mother controlled alone, ostensibly for a landscaping project that had never actually been approved by the full board. The complete truth landed heavily once Priya and I laid it all out together, a personal vendetta rooted in decades-old resentment over an inheritance, executed through the deliberate misuse of an elected position, sustained by collusion with my sister, and quietly enriched, in a small but very real way, through funds diverted from the very association my mother had been elected to serve honestly. The final confrontation happened exactly where the title of this story suggests it would, at the annual meeting itself in the community clubhouse, folding chairs full of neighbors who had no idea what they were about to witness. I didn't shout. When my name was called during the open grievance period, I stood, laid out the CC&R violation, the misused signatures, the diverted subaccount, and moved formally for the board to consider removal for cause under our own governing bylaws. I watched my mother's face across that room do something I'd never seen it do in front of other people, a controlled, practiced calm that couldn't quite cover what was happening underneath it. Mrs. Halloran from 2 doors down leaned over to her husband at one point and whispered, loudly enough for half the row to hear, "Well, that explains the boat," and I understood, watching neighbors glance at each other, that my mother's selective enforcement had quietly bothered more people than I'd realized, just not enough for anyone to have connected the pattern the way 11 months of documentation finally let me connect it in one sitting. The vote that followed wasn't dramatic in the way television makes these things look. It was folding chairs and raised hands, and a secretary carefully recording the count, 7 in favor of removal, 2 against, my mother's own seat declared vacant effective immediately. The board separately voted to void every fine issued outside the proper inspection process, refunding what I'd already paid along with the misdirected subaccount funds, and the lien threat that had hung over my grandmother's house for weeks simply, quietly, ceased to exist. The legal and financial consequences settled cleanly after that, my full balance zeroed out, the diverted funds returned to the HOA's reserve account, no criminal referral pursued, since Priya and the board agreed the misused subaccount, while improper, hadn't risen to a level either of us wanted to escalate further into something neither my mother nor our small neighborhood needed to carry any further than accountability already required. The emotional justice, when it arrived, didn't look like triumph. It looked like my mother avoiding eye contact with me in the clubhouse parking lot afterward, and Whitney calling me 2 days later, not to apologize but to ask, carefully, whether any of this changed anything about the house, a question that told me everything I needed to know about where her priorities had actually been the whole time. I told her no gently and let that be the last real conversation we've had since. The final quiet revelation came weeks later, going back through my grandmother's letter one more time, noticing a line near the very end I'd skimmed past too quickly the first time. Hoping this house gives you the peace the rest of us struggled to give each other. I sat on my own front porch with that letter, the same porch that had collected 11 months of yellow fine notices, and understood that my grandmother had known, somehow, long before any of this happened, exactly what kind of protection I'd eventually need this house to provide. I repainted the mailbox trim myself the following weekend, the exact shade of blue I'd always wanted instead of the approved beige, my first genuinely unapproved decision on that property in almost a year, and nobody came by on Friday to leave anything on my door about it. That's my story. 11 months of Fridays, one sealed letter, and an annual meeting that finally settled who that house was actually protecting me from. If this reminded you that small authority in the wrong hands can still do real damage, take that as your sign to read the bylaws, the will, the fine print, before you assume the people closest to you would never use it against you. Share this with someone who's ever had to fight for what was rightfully theirs. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.